Kingscreek is a horror podcast, and thus the content in this episode may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
You are now entering Kingscreek. Episode 8, Amphibians.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Damien Bachman, and today we've got a file marked Case A138, Amphibious Reconstruction, which seems pretty much to just be a copy of a police case file, one concerning the disappearance of Jason Nichols and the potential arson of his home. Jason Nichols was a recent high school graduate when this occurred. Well, recent is a strong word. He had been taking something of a gap year. This isn't to say that he was stuck at home or anything. Nichols found a job at the Chicken Bin, a local chicken fast food restaurant, and was even living on his own already, renting a little housing unit all by himself at only 20. Boy, that sounds nice. The 80s really were a different time. Things weren't all sunshine and roses for Mr. Nichols, though. In May of 1985, his house burned to the ground, leaving a pile of ash. When his landlord tried to pursue punitive action, he discovered that Nichols wasn't anywhere to be found. He wasn't with his parents, his brother, or any of his friends. More to the point, none of them had filed a missing persons report for Jason, despite not having seen him for weeks. So, the landlord was left to do so himself. To say the investigation was never solved would imply that there was ever really any serious effort put into it in the first place. Literally, one officer was assigned with trying to figure out what happened, and they unofficially put the case on indefinite hold after about 2 days. This isn't out of the ordinary, at least for the Kingscreek Sheriff's Department. Uncle Mark has a lot of very strong opinions about how they conduct their work scrawled in the margins here. But during those 2 days, they were able to get the witness account of one of his former classmates, a woman by the name of Clara Rallison. Miss Rallison's statement, while interesting, didn't ultimately play a role in the investigation, which is a shame because it really is quite something. May 28th, 1985. My relationship with Jason Nichols is one that was hard to properly define. We met in high school, grew very close, and then that fell apart. But it doesn't feel right to call him an ex-boyfriend because we still stayed good friends afterwards. I would even go as far as to say that for a time, he was my best friend. But there's still that low level of awkwardness that comes from a relationship that used to be a lot stronger than it is, so that label doesn't work either. So, if anyone asks, I usually just tell them that we're former classmates, because that, at least, is something concrete. A solid fact that won't change no matter what turbulent emotional swings we take. My point in all of this is that, at the end of the day, I knew Jason. I knew him very well, and we spent a lot of time together as recently as a month or so ago. We were connected, chained, really, in a way that seemed like we would stick around each other forever. But that changed when he got into his new hobby. Jason was always a bit odd. Not in any kind of off-putting way, at least not to me, but in a way where he always seemed just a little bit out of tune with everyone else. He would rarely pay attention to conversations with most people, but would become incredibly focused on the most random things. I remember one time he flunked an English exam in junior high because the time that he was supposed to be studying Lord of the Flies, he spent reading through the library's entire selection on the Californian Gold Rush. So, when we were hanging out and he told me that he had really been getting into salamanders lately, I didn't bat an eye. I figured this would just be his new thing for a while. He would read all that he could, maybe write an essay or two, then he'd move on, and the cycle would continue. Then, he took me on a walk through the forest. This was about 2 months ago. towards the end of March. We were on one of our regular trails that took us through the woods. It was newly spring, and the world still felt like it was defrosting. Melting snow dripped from tree branches as we walked through the damp undergrowth. Normally, we were slow, meandering, taking in the sights while chatting a little. Today, though, Jason moved quickly, hardly ever turning his head to look at the trees or say anything to me. He was taller than I am, with wider strides, so I had to almost skip to keep up. He was confident, determined in his pace. Even when about halfway through the route, he veered directly off the trail and kept moving forward, despite my protests. When I finally caught up to him, he was kneeling, bent over a moss-caked log. He beckoned for me to come closer, not taking his eyes off the dead tree. The whole thing was very confusing, but I knew better than to argue with him, so I kneeled down and craned my neck over to see what he was so focused on. It seemed like a regular log to me. We sat there for a minute. I tried to ask him what we were doing, but he just shushed me, still not taking his eyes off the log. Then, in one quick motion, he lifted it up, tearing it from its bed of grass and mud. What I saw underneath made my skin crawl. There were about a half-dozen wet, slimy salamanders underneath the log. They were motionless at first, but almost the second sunlight streaming through the trees touched their wet, yellow-spotted skin, they all started wriggling. I don't even know what it was about them, about the way they moved or the way they piled on top of each other, sliding around, but for a split second, it was deeply unnerving. That was the time Jason finally started speaking. He excitedly chattered about the amphibians in front of us. He said they were long-toed salamanders, which are native to Washington. He kept going on about how they, unlike a lot of other amphibians, rarely hibernated, especially in lower elevations, and how it was really exciting that we could see them in person because of where we lived. I just nodded and tried to keep my eyes off the squirming pile inches away from my knees. Suddenly, Jason stopped speaking. His stare was locked on to the salamanders, and I realized with a start that I didn't think I had seen him blink. The silence hung in the air for a few moments, during which the noises of the forest seemed almost muted. I could still hear birds singing and crickets chirping, but it was as if someone had turned down the volume knob on a stereo to almost zero. When I shifted my focus away from the forest, I almost jumped at the sight of Jason staring directly at me. I hadn't noticed him turn his attention away from the salamanders, and now he had me locked in the same unblinking stare he had given them. Looking back, this was the first time I think I realized something was off with him. There was something in his eyes, something behind them even, that was wrong. And as he spoke, there was an edge to his voice that made what he said something I will never forget. Salamanders, as amphibians, live on the boundary between land and water, a boundary most species crossed millions of years ago. It's like they're stuck between evolving, frozen during a pivotal change. Isn't that interesting? Then the moment was over, and he was back to looking at the salamanders. I felt weird the rest of the day. There was a kind of uncomfortable silence on the walk out of the forest and the drive home. I had known Jason for long enough and well enough that I thought nothing about him would surprise me anymore, but that something in his eyes, it wouldn't leave my mind. He got distant after that. Our regular hangouts started to dwindle. Every few days became once a week, then once every 2 weeks. He would rarely answer the phone if I called. Normally, I wouldn't be too worried. He had a tendency to get wrapped up in obsessions or projects and become distant in the process, but the interaction in the woods still bothered me. When he ignored my call for the third time one morning, I decided to go over to his place to check on him. His home, a small, single-room housing unit over by the North Forest, seemed normal, at least from the outside. The lights weren't on in any of the windows, and I wondered if he was even home. His bike was on the front porch, however, and I knew he never went out without it. I knocked 4 times before the door finally opened. Jason looked like he hadn't been taking care of himself or sleeping for days. His hair was all tangled up, his face unshaven, and he was dressed in a stained, sweat-soaked t-shirt and a baggy pair of sweatpants. He would have looked like he was moments away from falling asleep if his eyes weren't wide and alert. Looking into them, I froze as I saw that familiar flickering behind his eyes, the wrongness. I barely was able to react to him quickly pulling me into his house and shutting the door behind me. "I'm so glad you're here," said Jason, moving briskly to the other side of the room. "I've been hoping I can show someone what I've been working on." Jason's place wasn't quite one room, but it might as well have been. It was small, cramped, and usually cozy. I had been here countless times before, and there was usually bright, warm light from the lamps, posters covering the walls, and an old movie playing on his big TV from his massive collection of VHS tapes. It was a sight I had grown so accustomed to that it was almost like a second home for me, something that usually brought up the previously mentioned undefinable feelings about our relationship. Today, though, it was a completely different place. The smell was the first thing I noticed, the unmistakable, powerful odor of a man who didn't clean up after himself, tinged with something else. Something like earth? Dirt? However, the main divergence was that everything was dark. The lights were all off, the window blinds and curtains were all shut, and the massive TV sat completely dormant in its corner of the room, something I couldn't recall it ever being. Jason usually would leave it on all the time, even when he slept. The only source of light was the pale glow of a small electric lamp. It was bent over a massive, easily 500-gallon terrarium that took up half the room and was what Jason was now bent over, watching the tank like a hawk. I edged closer to see what it was he had inside, and when I saw the contents, my stomach dropped. Filling the entire bottom of the tank was a multicolored carpet of churning, wriggling salamanders, crawling on top of each other and sliding around in a thin layer of slimy, dirty water. They flopped around like fish, always constantly struggling against each other. I was speechless, unable to really grapple what I was looking at. It was gross, sure, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why it disturbed me so much. Maybe I subconsciously knew something worse was coming. "Want to see something cool?" Jason almost whispered the words, not waiting for a response before he reached his hand into the writhing mass, grabbed one of the salamanders, and lifted it towards me. It was small, black, with a single red stripe down its back. It sat in Jason's open palm, its body rising and falling in quick, small breaths, bulbous, jet black eyes practically popping out of its head. Jason lifted it up to my eye level. Salamanders are largely defenseless. They're small, they don't have any kind of armor or claws. Some species don't even have teeth. But they are very, very good at one thing: distraction. So if one is startled or threatened enough, he lightly flicked the back of his palm near the salamander. The effect was immediate. It started wriggling away, almost flinging itself off of Jason's hand back into the tank. But before it fell, its long tail detached from its body, and it started to flop around in his palm like a black, fleshy worm. Now my stomach was churning, watching the detached tail squirm and wriggle in Jason's hand. I started to wonder why I had even come over, and how many of the salamanders were tailless in the tank. I even managed to stammer out my first word since arriving and asked if it hurt the creatures. He chuckled and shook his head like I was a small child who had just asked him if the sky was orange. "It'll be fine. Their tails grow back. In fact, all parts of the salamander grow back completely, given enough time. Tails, legs, eyes, and even some organs. They're truly remarkable creatures." As he said this, I truly looked at him for the first time. He hadn't moved his eyes from the wriggling tail in his palm, and when he spoke, I could see a small, unnatural-looking smile spread across his lips. The wrongness in his eyes was the most prominent I'd ever seen it, and maybe it was just a trick of the light, but it seemed as though it had spread. The sweat on his face and neck shone in the pale lamplight, looking for all the world like the wet skin of the creatures in the tank. For the first time, I saw him blinking, but he didn't blink normally. His eyelids slowly slid across his eyes, one after the other, out of sync with each other, almost like a salamander. I left quickly after that, making some kind of excuse on my way out the door. If the encounter in the forest had raised my suspicions, this had all but confirmed them. There was something seriously wrong with Jason, and I didn't know what to do about it. I tried to avoid him in the following weeks. Looking back, I wonder what I should have done differently. He might have been sick with something, or mentally unwell, or, I don't know, possessed? But in the end, it didn't really matter, because I didn't take action until it was too late. About a week ago, I got a call from Jason's bosses. Apparently, he hadn't been coming to work the last couple of days and wasn't answering his phone, so they had chosen to notify his emergency contact, aka me. They said to let him know that he had one more day to either show up for work or he would be, in their words, terminated with prejudice. I went over, of course. I was scared of Jason, of what he was becoming, but he was still my friend, or former classmate at least, and I didn't want to see him lose his job. So I went back over to his place. It was once again quiet, with those same darkened windows. I walked up the stairs onto the porch and prepared to pound on the door. After the first knock, however, the door slowly swung open, creaking on its hinges. It hadn't been closed, let alone locked. Trepidatiously, I made my way inside. Like the last time, the smell was the first thing to wash over me. But this time, that earthy undertone was more like an overtone. The air itself was different, too. It was damp, humid, but also cold at the same time. The lamplight was dimmer than before, so it was even harder to see the interior. The walls seemed dirty, though. Something was strewn across them, leaving dark stains. My eyes passed over the room and came to a rest on Jason's bed. A blanket covered a large shape lying on the mattress. It was moving, and I assumed it was Jason. I wished I had noticed the tails hanging over the edge of the bed frame before I ripped the blanket off in one sweeping motion. My skin crawled as I saw, instead of Jason, a pile of writhing, squirming salamanders. They squeaked and squished and slid and wriggled in a constant wave of motion and struggle. I didn't even notice at first that they were all crawling around something much larger. I crept forward to get a better look in the dim light, and when I finally saw what it was, I almost screamed. Fleshy, pale skin stretched over a palm, extending over 5 fingers with dirty fingernails. The bottom half was splattered with dark, crusted blood, all leading to a jagged stump. It was a severed hand. Jason's severed hand. I think I actually did scream, or at least I gasped or made some kind of noise, because a moment later I saw movement coming from the little kitchenette. I heard the click of a lighter, and then within moments a candle illuminated the whole back corner, and I saw him. Jason stood behind the bar of the kitchenette, shirtless, shiny with slimy sweat. He had that same unnerving smile, this time stretched wide across his face. His eyes were black, jet black, like the eyes of the salamanders writhing around his chopped off hand. Only, his hand wasn't chopped off. At the end of his forearm, where there should have been a dripping stump, there was a healthy, fully functioning hand. The only clue that anything was amiss was the flesh. It was inhumanly pale, almost blue, with dark spots. When he spoke, his voice was wet, like he was speaking through a layer of phlegm. The science of salamanders is, of course, fascinating, but what I find more interesting now is the mythology. With his new hand, Jason picked up the candle, studying the flickering flame. Salamanders have historically been seen as creatures of fire. Whether they create it, eat it, or simply live in it, the details change from culture to culture. But one thing is consistent. It is their true home. So, it stands to reason that there is one more step to this experiment. With that, he dropped the candle onto the carpet. The flame spread quickly, engulfing Jason and creating a wall between me and the other half of the room. With the split second of bright light, I was able to see that every surface, every wall, every countertop was covered in shiny, writhing salamanders. I ran, and I ran. I don't know why I didn't tell anyone what happened. I guess I just didn't want to say it out loud. I still haven't, I guess, since I'm just writing it down. But I figure someone needs to know what I saw, even if it won't change anything. The long, torrid chapter of my life with Jason Nichols is over. And as horrible as it seems, and with all the guilt it gives me to say, I can't help but feel relieved. End of witness statement. Even though this case is technically unsolved, it seems pretty open and shut to me. Whatever was going on with Mr. Nichols, it's clear how the house burned to the ground. The really interesting part to me is that preliminary forensic analysis of the place didn't show any traces of biological material. If Miss Rallison is to be believed, somehow, Jason and all of those salamanders survived that fire. If it's true. Again, this is only a single witness statement, and Miss Rallison seemingly was under duress, so maybe not every detail can be trusted. But it does give new context for some files here that mention sightings of a white-skinned frogman in the northern part of the woods. This is Damien Bachman, signing off.
Today's episode of Kingscreek was written and performed by Thomas S. Dennis. It was produced by James Makepeace, and the score was composed by Kai After Kai. Script supervision is provided by James Makepeace and Ryan Kennedy. Our cover art is by CyberGrapeUK, and our social media manager is Ryan Kennedy. All episodes are a production of Tracer Magnum Entertainment. If you'd like to support the show, rate and review us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Chatbox, or whatever service you use to listen to our show. It helps tremendously and ensures we're seen by more and more of the unsuspecting public. If you'd like to get in touch with us or become involved with the community, join our Discord server or follow us on Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, and Tumblr, all under the handle @KingscreekOfficial. Share with your friends, family, or anyone else you want to ensnare in our web. And above all else, thank you for listening.